How's it going, everyone? I got a comment recently asking more about what keybinds I use, as well as asking what keyboard and mouse I use, and so I thought it'd be a fun video to make to kind of talk about that. To answer the second part of this question quickly here at the beginning, for my keyboard I do use a SteelSeries Apex 7, and for my mouse I do use a Razer Basilisk V3. This is not a MMO mouse like a lot of other WoW players might use. I typically prefer a mouse with just 2 or 3 side buttons and not really anything more than that, so the Razer Basilisk having 3 side buttons is pretty much perfect for me. Now, talking more in the way of key bindings, I do want to put a disclaimer out here at the beginning. I'll go through all of the keybinds that I use myself, and I'll tell you why I use these keybinds that I do. But I don't think that these are necessarily perfect. I don't think that if you're looking at this for recommendations on what keybinds you should use, that you should just copy these directly or anything like that. Hopefully what you can get out of this is, as I talk through the keybinds I use and my reasoning behind using them, you can kind of take that and adapt it to yourself and keep some of the concepts in mind while you're doing your own key bindings. And with that, in disclaimer, let's jump right into it, starting out with my movement key bindings. My movement key bindings are probably a bit different from most PvE players, and that's because when I started doing keybinds and learning to improve my movement, I was largely influenced by PvP Twitch streamers and YouTubers like Rekfold and Seedu. And for that reason, the only keybinds that I use for movement are actually A and D for strafe left and strafe right. I'll talk about why exactly I use A and D for this rather than the default of Q and E when we get to my actual keyboard layout here in a minute. The rest of my movement is entirely done using just my mouse, so right click to look around and left and right click together to move in the direction that I'm facing. I also have my auto run toggle on my middle mouse button, and I use that quite often as well, as you'll see in a clip of me playing in a little bit. If you're someone that is still using WASD for movement, and you're now wondering if you should just move on to only using your strafe keys similar to me, then I would say, for one, if you are using A and D and you're still keyboard turning, I would definitely try to break that habit and start getting used to using your mouse to actually turn. You can see as an example right here, the difference between me keyboard turning and how much quicker I can actually turn if I just use my mouse instead. So that is definitely an important skill to pick up. When it comes to moving forward and backward, I don't think there's any reason that you should stop using keybinds for that if that's how you're moving currently. Some people will argue that backpedaling is bad and you should not have a bound and you should never do it. But I personally am in the camp that I do think that, at least in PvE, there are some times when you do want to actually have a backpedaling keybind just for moments of precise movement, especially if you're a class like a tank and you really need to position bosses and mobs correctly. Backpedaling can be a great help for that. As a last note for movement, I do also use my mouse button 4 for movement-based abilities. So on my Shaman, for example, I have Ghost Wolf bound here. If I was playing a warrior, I might have Heroic Leap bound here. Or if I was playing a hunter, I would have something like Aspect of the Cheetah bound here. And I think that about wraps up everything for my movement key bindings. Let's take a look at the keybinds I use for the rest of my abilities. Looking at this keyboard here, all of the keys in the light bluish gray color are keybinds that I use. The 4 at the top that are floating there, those are the function 1 through 4 keys as well, even though they're not marked. The 2 keys in yellow are, of course, my movement bindings that I talked about at the first part of this video. I also don't have the modifier keys marked here, but we will be talking about those later on. So let's start off here by talking why A and D instead of Q and E. I originally did use Q and E for this, but during Shadowlands I actually made the decision to redo all of my keybinds from the ground up, and I made the move to A and D. And I did this because generally when you play, you're going to rest your hand by default on your movement keybinds. And from there, you're going to move your hand either up or down your keyboard to press abilities as needed. And I realized for me, it was much more comfortable to move my hand upwards on my keyboard to hit abilities rather than downwards. So when my binds were on Q and E, I only had 1 row of abilities that I could comfortably hit above those 2 movement binds, and then I had 1 row below that I could comfortably hit. When it came to Z, X, C, and V at the very bottom of the keyboard, I was using these, but it just didn't feel comfortable for my hand. So when I moved down to A and D, I can now comfortably hit that bottom row on my keyboard, and I can still comfortably hit the number keys as well as the Q, W, E, R, and T row. And definitely make sure to keep comfort in mind when doing your own key bindings, because if you're not comfortable with them, then you're probably just going to play worse and probably going to end up hurting your hand in some way. After deciding what keys to use for movement, you'll want to use those as a central point to start putting the rest of your abilities around. For me, this means that the keys marked in green here are where I want to start putting my core rotational abilities. Since I use A and D for strafing, my ring finger rests on A and my pointer finger rests on D, which means that my middle finger sits right on S, making the S key a great starting point for my specific setup. This is where I typically put any sort of builder type of ability. And for Enhancement Shaman specifically, I have my Storm Strike here. Very similar to this, I use Caps Lock as well for abilities that I frequently use as a builder type of spell or filler type of ability. I find this to be a very underrated keybind that is quite easy to hit with either my ring finger by moving it just off of the A key, or by just bringing my pinky up and pressing it that way. And for Enhancement Shaman specifically, I have my Lava Lash here. One very important thing to keep in mind here is that I'm saying the types of abilities that I put on these specific keybinds first rather than what ability I do have on these keybinds. And the reason for that is you really want these keybinds to be universal regardless of what class you're playing. So for example, like I said, these are my keybinds that I use for builder types of spells. So on my Survival Hunter, I have S keybound to Mongoose Bite and Caps Lock bound to Kill Command. Or on my Paladin, I have Templar Strike bound to S and Blade of Justice bound to Caps Lock. Looking one row up, I use Q and W typically for spender types of abilities. Q is always going to be my AoE focused spender, so for enhancement, this is Chain Lightning. And W is going to be my single target focus spender, which would be Lightning Bolt. E is something that I use for spells that are somewhat frequently casted, but typically have a low cooldown. For enhancement, this ends up being my Frost Shock. And finally, to the right of that is the R key. I use this for cooldowns that are frequently used mid-combat. So for enhancement, this ends up being my Feral Spirit. And then right below that is the F key, which I also use for frequently used cooldowns. So typically this is my Primordial Wave, or if I'm running the Storm build, this would be my Doom Winds. Looking down to the bottom row, these are again spells that are frequently used but typically have somewhat longer cooldowns. On the Z key, I have Sundering, but on other classes that actually have executes, this ends up being my Execute key. On X, I have Ice Strike. And on C, I have my most frequently used defensive ability, which on enhancement is, of course, Astral Shift. The remaining keys at this point get a little bit farther from my movement keys, meaning that I need to move my hand farther away to hit these. And for that reason, these are generally utility spells that I'm not hitting in my core rotation very frequently, things like heals or stuns or interrupts, with the exception of the number 2 and 3 keys. On my number 2 key, I typically put damage over time spells like Flame Shock. And on my number 3 key, this is where I actually have Crash Lightning. I'm gonna be honest, you're probably wondering, why don't I just move these a little bit closer and move something like Primordial Wave or Feral Spirit up here? And I think that's actually a really fair point. I think what happened with my keybindings for these is that when I played with my strafe on Q and E, these keybinds were still on 2 and 3, and then when I moved my keybinds down, I didn't actually move these for whatever reason. But now I'm still comfortably able to move my middle finger up and hit 2 and 3, while keeping my other fingers on my strafe keys, and so these just work out well for me. Starting on the bottom row, my V key is used for stuns like Capacitor Totem. Right above that, the G key is where I put my healing spells, in this case Healing Surge. And the row above that, my T key is where I put class-specific utility types of spells, and for Enhancement Shaman, this ends up being my Wind Fury Totem. Then moving up to the top row, going left to right, the tilde key is another similar utility-focused spell button, and for Enhancement, this ends up being my Wind Rush Totem. And to the right of that, my number 1 key is my Interrupt button. Then of course the 2 and 3 keys we've already talked about. Moving on to the number 4 key, this ends up being kind of a free space for me for whatever I need at the time. I have used my Purge on this before, but more often than not, this ends up being my on-use trinket button if I am running one. And then the number 5 key is just another class-specific utility spell type of deal. And for enhancement specifically, I have Ancestral Guidance here. And then moving on to the function key row, function key number 1 is where I put any additional movement spells that I have. For enhancement, this ends up being Spirit Walk or Gust of Wind, depending on which I'm running. Function key number 2 is mainly for my racial abilities. Although if I have a damage specific racial ability, I will likely map that to some other key in a macro, but my shaman is currently a goblin, and so I use this for rocket jump. Function key number 3, I actually don't have anything mapped here for whatever reason, I just have a gap, but then function key number 4 is where I keep my gateway control shard to just easily be able to use warlock gates. Which, by the way, if you don't have one of these, definitely pick one up. Covers all of my normal keybinds, so let's quickly talk about modifier keys. The modifier keys are of course referring to the Shift, Alt, and Control buttons, and these are very important for keybinding because it allows you to essentially double, triple, or even quadruple the amount of keybinds that you already have. Shift is probably the most commonly used of these because as your hand is sitting on your keyboard, typically your pinky is probably resting right on top of the Shift key or right nearby it. Whereas the Alt and Control keys can be a little bit more difficult to shift your hand to press. When it comes to me personally, I of course play a little bit differently though. I used to rely very heavily on using the Shift key, but I actually moved to start using the Control key instead. But I don't use Control on my keyboard like a normal person. I actually have Control mapped to my mouse button 5. And so whenever I use my modifier keys, I'm actually just holding down my extra mouse button. I realize that this sounds really weird, but hear me out. So back when I moved my movement key bindings down, I actually tried to stop using modifier keys altogether. And the reason I did that was I felt like using Shift constantly was putting a lot of strain on my pinky, and so therefore I tried to do away with that. Unfortunately, Enhancement Shaman has so many binds that I couldn't entirely get away from modifier keys, and so that's when I started to try to map one of these modifier keys to my mouse and use it there. And for some reason I decided to do that with Control just in case I would ever use Shift anyways. And so that's how I kind of got where I am now. But if you look at the modifier keys that I actually use, which are marked here again in that bluish gray color, I still don't depend on modifiers too much. And for the modifier keys that I do use, most of these I look as being kind of extensions upon the spells that are below them. And what I mean by that is, like I said earlier, my C key is used for my defensive abilities. So if I have more than one defensive ability, then my Control C would become my next defensive ability, which would be Earth Elemental in the case of Enhancement Shaman. And then the same goes for my V key, which was my Capacitor Totem. I now have my Thunderstorm here as Control V. On Caps Lock, I have a macro of Lava Lash that is a mouse over macro. That way in AoE scenarios, without tab targeting, I can just Lava Lash to a different target and spread my lashing flames that way. On my W key, which was my single target spender, I have a different version of a single target spender, which is my Elemental Blast or Lava Burst if I'm not running Elemental Blast. And then on my Control 2 key, this is where I keep my health pot. And similarly, on my Control 4 key is where I keep my health stone. Don't ask me why I have a gap between those. I honestly have no idea why. I never really thought about it until now, but I do. And that really covers all of my key bindings. So hopefully this gave you an overview of how I play. Hopefully it might have even given you some ideas for doing your own key bindings. But if you have any questions or just general comments, definitely be sure to leave a comment below and have a nice day.